Even that short snapshot there of some of his lyrics, the power of his writing was incredible, wasn't it? Heroin's my life, heroin's my wife.
Yeah, it was for a while too. He had a very bad drug habit in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, which, I mean, he's been quite clean living for the last 25, 30 years. Yeah, but that's a very intense song, along with sort of Venus and Furs. But then you've a song that opens that album, the famous Velvet Underground album called Sunday Morning, which Nico, the singer, with him in the band, and it's one of the most beautiful things you could play any morning. It's just so uplifting and beauty, and he would go from cruelty and pain to absolute joy and beauty in 40 minutes of an album. It was quite. He wasn't a one-trick pony. I mean, he was limited, people would say, vocally, but most of the greats are Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan. You know what I'm saying?
You mentioned Andy Warhol there and Nico, of course. We're also joined by Declan Long, who's here to talk a little bit about that connection, I suppose, that Lou Reed had with the art scene of New York that was so exciting at the time. Declan, this effect, this influence that this man Andy Warhol had on Lou Reed, can you begin to describe it to us?
Well, he was a curator in some ways of the Velvet Underground, if we want to use that word, and through the influence of his friend and collaborator Paul Morrissey, they pulled the Velvet Underground into this world of the factory, and they pulled Nico from Germany into the Velvet Underground and created for a time this really unique configuration of talent and ambition and strangeness and decadence, and this was presented in the form of this extraordinary multimedia event, The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which was the basis of this album, the first album, The Velvet Underground and Nico.
So when Andy Warhol, though, first stumbled across Lou Reed, he was nobody as such. He was just starting out. Andy Warhol was the star.
Yeah, I mean, Warhol was much older, was very well established by that stage, you know, significant pioneer of pop art. And Warhol really was convinced that there was essentially money and fame, more of it to be found through the rock and roll world. And so that was part of the process, you know, that Paul Morrissey was pushing him to take them on. But the thing was that they identified the most incredible sympathy, the younger man, Lou Reed, and the older man, Andy Warhol, in terms of, you know, something real that they saw needed to be done, a new energy, a new direction for art and culture in this extraordinary congruence of ideas.
Gavin, do you accept then that Andy Warhol had a profound effect on Lou Reed?
Yes, I think so, very much so. I mean, Lou Reed was, I think his early job, he was almost like sort of like Carole King, a bit of a would-be songwriter working in the sort of like wannabe hit factory into Motown. He had a traumatic youth, as in he underwent shock treatment when he was very young because of his sexual preferences, and his parents sent him into hospital. And he formed a band, and he met up with, Warhol opened up those doors for him. I mean, where it's really articulated is a good few years after Warhol's death, John Cale, the other brilliant brain in the Velvet Underground, and himself put out a beautiful album called Songs for Drella, which is basically Lou and John Cale telling the story of how they met and how important Warhol was to them.
And Nico is an interesting, controversial figure in this story as well. Declan, what was the relationship there?
Well, Nico was brought in to add this extra dimension to the band, and not necessarily warmly welcomed into the band. You know, they sort of saw, you know, the talent in some ways with the interest and angle there, but you know, Reed it was still his band really. Warhol asked him to write songs for Nico, especially for her. I'll Be Your Mirror, Femme Fatale, fantastic outcomes therefore, but nevertheless, you know, they were being pulled in different directions. Nico played that very well, it should be said. You know, she was able to spend time with John Cale, spend time with Lou Reed, and you know, for me, I must say that her presence created a very distinct magic in that early stage of the Velvet Underground. So she was a very special, important presence, even though she wasn't necessarily a settled presence within the band right then.
A.B. Philbin Bowman joins us as well. A.B., you've been trawling through archive footage today of Lou Reed. And just Gavin mentioned there that he was a unique individual, but he could have his moments. He was truculent and stubborn at times in public.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to note that at a time when the Rolling Stones were being persuaded to go on US TV to change their lyrics to "Let's spend the night together," which is not really a very explicit lyric, to "Let's spend some time together," here was Lou Reed singing about oral sex, heroin and transvestites. But he had it was famously difficult to interview, and he certainly didn't have a great time for the media. He wasn't playing the media game, as it were. And we dug up a clip of a press conference he gave in Sydney in 1974, and some journalists were trying to interview him, and this is the response that they got.
You like singing about drugs. Is this because you like taking drugs yourself?
No, it's because I can't carry when I go through customs. I figure somebody in the audience.
Were you searched by our customs men for drugs?
Oh no, because I don't take any.
No drugs at all?
Mm-mm.
And yet you sing about them.
I'm high on life.
Do you want people to take drugs themselves? Is this perhaps why you sing about drugs?
Oh yeah, I want them to take drugs.
Why is this?
Because it's better than Monopoly.
Lou, do you think it's a decadent society we're living in?
No.
Would you describe yourself as a decadent person?
No.
How would you describe yourself?
Average.
Lou, you're a man of few words. Why is this?
I don't have anything to say.
He sounds like somebody who was nearly enjoying himself there, Gavin. And when we see some of the phrases and the quotes that have been floating around today, he seems like he must have been very entertaining company to be in, particularly if you were not part of the media but a friend.
Yeah, I mean, he was a man that loved conversation. He wasn't a big party guy when I knew him, but he could sit around and have a bottle of wine and talk for hours. But he wouldn't talk just about himself. He'd talk about new music, art, particularly loved poetry. He was a huge fan of Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, and then his wife, Laurie Anderson. I mean, just phenomenal, just people to be around, but warm, engaging, and caring. And he didn't stop. I mean, he was always pushing himself and pushing himself. If you look at his records, they're so eclectic. He would jump from A to Z all the time. He had pop hits with the album Transformer and jumped in to make one of his darkest albums straight after he started having hits, which contradict everything, sort of, if you wanted to talk to the conveyor belt of rock and roll. He didn't get on that conveyor belt. Yeah.
So many of his songs were covered by bands, though, and I mean the classic U2 version of Satellite of Love is one that's very popular, of course. Do you have any sense of what he meant to Bono and to U2, and obviously to you guys as you were forming?
Yeah, it was a touchstone. It was like, you know, it was him and Bowie that opened the doors for us. You know, punk gave us the keys to the car, whereas the DIY of punk let us form bands, but you know, when we were 12, 13, it was Bowie and Lou Reed were telling us there's a big world out there, and you can get in there. Well, we didn't think we could get in there, and then we did. So, yeah, it's huge. It's huge, this loss. Yeah.
To end, Gavin, can I ask you to share, is there any particular favourite memory that you have today as you think about him?
That's difficult. I mean, he was very kind to me, very supportive to my work. And he liked the fact that I was artistically, a lot of people would see me as awkward, and I think he likes that about me. He just, you know, he always just says the only thing you can do, Gavin, is when you're writing, just tell the truth, and even if it's made up, it's the truth, and then you can write it. So, I mean, there's so much. I don't know. I actually was very upset last night when he passed, so I'm still a bit speechless about certain things.
Holly came from Miami, FLA.